Dobro večer svima, dobrodošli na naš jedan stream. Večeras, dosta ranije, čekamo obraćanje guvernera Federalnih rezervi Jerome Powella za javnost. Kamatne stope su podignute 0,25, sad su 4,75 totalno. Za kraj godine se predviđa 4,748, što znači, ako budu ostali verni svojim izjavama da će da guraju to na 5,5, verovatno nas negde pred kraj godine i očekuje popuštanje tih kamatnih stopa, što je ono, za špekulacije ok priča. Dok čekam da počne ta konferencija za štampu, da pretrčim neke vesti. U Britaniji masovni protesti, verovatno neko nezadovoljstvo što se tiče ekonomske situacije u zemlji. Dolazile su izjave tipa JP Morgan, Bank of America, da će čak i ako Amerika izbegne recesiju, Evropa upadne u blagu recesiju, Britanija biti najteže pogođena od svih u svakom slučaju. Ovo je, kako kažu, najveći protest u proteklih 10 godina. U Francuskoj juče bilo otprilike 500 miliona ljudi na ulicama, tako da nezadovoljstvo onako generalno počinje da kuva. Biće zanimljivo proleće, verovatno vruće leto. Indija je uporna u svojoj nameri da ostvari 30% poreza na kripto. Tako i to će bude zanimljivo posmatrati. GPT unleashes stock trader stampede. Što se napominju, ne samo ja, to je postalo jasno pre nekog vremena da će sve što bude bilo povezivano sa veštačkom inteligencijom stvarati svojevrsne manije i stampeda, i to je generalno počelo polako se dešava, samo što još nema toliko love na tržištu, pa verovatno nije efekat toliko jak, ali ako doživimo taj bull run sljedeći put, bit će ludo. Ovo sam prenao isto pre neko veče. New York kupuje neobično velike količine nafte i benzina od Indije, zemlja koja je postala top outlet za sankcionisanu rusku naftu. Jednostavno glupa ideja da se ukine jedan od najvećih proizvođača i snabdevača globalnog tržišta energentima. Nikakav problem, prodaće ga nekom drugom, pa će taj da lupi na to par procenata zarade, pa će da to distribuira po Americi i Evropi. I Cassandra, poznati Michael Burry, Big Short, sinoć je tweetovao sell, ali Kramer je stvarno objavio da smo u novom bull marketu, da treba da se kupuje, tako da ne znam šta bi rekao na to, otprilike super priča. Ako inversujemo Kramera, treba da prodamo, a i Michael Burry kaže da se proda, tako da, ovo je Greg odgovorio, ostavio sam to tu zašto sam znao da će Burry ima taj trip, on istituje nešto i onda ima neki lik, neki poremeće, nešto, briše non stop Twitter nalog, tweetuje, pa briše tweetove, pa ne znam ni on šta radi tako često, i ali nema veze, ostalo je sačuvano na drugim Twitterima, tako da ok. Što se tiče S&P-a, S&P imao lepe swingove, intraday, to jest ovo je časovni 0,72%, što je ok, malo jači swing. Bullish engulfing candle juče, danas slaba prodaja. Ova vest je odlično sela kao mečki na rupu, tako da samo još da sačekamo te podatke o inflaciji, verovatno kao fora Jim Cramer, kako kaže, recesija otkazana, i idemo gore. Bitcoin je malo jače reagovao, ali je ta reakcija poništena, verovatno se čeka sad ova konferencija za štampu da Jerome pojasni tačno šta ima da pojasni. Pa onda ćemo da vidimo verovatno neko ozbiljnije kretanje cena. Koliko sati? Još 3 minuta. Mada oni ume da je kasnije po pola sata sa tim konferencijama, tako da ću za to vreme da pretrčim neke kripto gluposti, da vidim šta se dešava, mada ništa specijalno, da vidim ko je to zelen danas bio, Storgy i ICX. Dobro. Atom jedini izgleda prkosi tržištu. Tu smo na 786. Fib range-a ništa specijalno, 68%. Imamo još par nivoa da pretrčimo. Pa da kažemo da može da dođe do pravog pumpanja cena. Što se tiče Atoma, Dodge je juče nešto pumpao, mada koliko vidim danas su ti dobici poništeni. Što nije loša stvar. Što da ne konačno potvrdimo ovaj proboj i da možemo da krenemo lagano na gore. Kad kažem lagano, mislim ekspresno. Pošto otprilike takav nivo je u pitanju. 70-80% dobitka potencijalno odmah. Se manemo tih džukačkih coina, da vidim šta rade pravi udarači. Evo ga Jerome. Evo ga batica Jerome, da ugasimo ovu glupost. Ajde Jerome.
Good afternoon and welcome. My colleagues and I understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and we are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 25 basis points. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance for some time. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 1%. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter. Consumer spending appears to be expanding at a subdued pace, in part reflecting tighter financial conditions over the past year. Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate at a 50-year low, job vacancies still very high, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 247,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. Although the pace of job gains has slowed over the course of the past year and nominal wage growth has shown some signs of easing, the labor market continues to be out of balance. Labor demand substantially exceeds the supply of available workers, and the labor force participation rate has changed little from a year ago. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in December, total PCE prices rose 5.0%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.4%. The inflation data received over the past 3 months show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of increases. And while recent developments are encouraging, we will need substantially more evidence to be confident that inflation is on a sustained downward path. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that's not grounds for complacency. Although inflation has moderated recently, it remains too high. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, bringing the target range to 4.5% to 4.75%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the past year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, particularly housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 25 basis points today, continuing the step down from last year's rapid pace of increases. Shifting to a slower pace will better allow the committee to assess the economy's progress toward our goals, as we determine the extent of future increases that will be required to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. We have been taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. we at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Chris.
Chris Rugaber, the Associated Press. Thank you for doing this. As you know, financial conditions have loosened since the fall, with bond yields falling, which has also brought down mortgage rates, and the stock market posted a solid gain in January. Does that make your job of combating inflation harder? And could you see lifting rates higher than you otherwise would to offset the increase in, or to offset the easing of financial conditions?
So it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place in order to bring inflation down to 2%. And of course, financial conditions have tightened very significantly over the past year. I would say that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on sustained changes to broader financial conditions. And it is our judgment that we're not yet at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance, which is why we say that we expect ongoing hikes will be appropriate. Of course, many things affect financial conditions, not just our policy. And we will take into account overall financial conditions along with many other factors as we set policy.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you for taking our questions. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Over the last quarter, we've seen a deceleration in prices, in wages, and a fall in consumer spending, all while the unemployment rate has been able to stay at a historic low. Does this at all change your view of how much the unemployment rate would need to go up, if at all, to see inflation come down to the levels you're looking for?
So I would say it is a good thing that the disinflation that we have seen so far has not come at the expense of a weaker labor market. But I would also say that that disinflationary process that you now see underway is really at an early stage. What you see is really in the goods sector, you see inflation now coming down because supply chains have been fixed. Demand is shifting back to services, and shortages have been abated. So you see that in the housing services sector. We expect inflation to continue moving up for a while, but then to come down, assuming that new leases continue to be lower. So in those two sectors, you've got a good story. The issue is that we have a large sector called non-housing service, core non-housing services, where we don't see disinflation yet. But I would say that so far, what we see is progress, but without any weakening in labor market conditions.
Has your
Go ahead.
Has your expectation for where the unemployment rate might go changed since December?
You know, we're going to write down new forecasts at the March meeting, and we'll see at that time. I will say that it is gratifying to see the disinflationary process now getting underway, and we continue to get strong labor market data. But you know, we'll update those forecasts in March.
Ništa to ne sprečava S&P 500 da pumpa.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. You and some of your colleagues have emphasized the possibility that job openings could come down and that that would let some of the air out of the labor market without major job losses. We saw the opposite in the December JOLTS this morning, job openings actually rising. That also has coincided with slowdown in wage inflation. Do you believe that openings are an important indicator to be studying to understand where the labor market is and where wage inflation might be heading?
So you're right about the data, of course. What we've seen average hourly earnings and now the employment cost index abating a little bit, still off of their highs of 6 months ago and more, but still at levels that are fairly elevated. The job openings number in JOLTS has been quite volatile recently, and I did see that it moved back up this morning. I do think that it's probably an important indicator. The ratio, I guess, is back up to 1.9 job openings to unemployed people who are looking for work. So it's an indicator, but nonetheless, you're right. We do see wages moving down. If you look across the rest of the labor market, you still see very high payroll job creation, and quits are still at an elevated level. So by many indicators, the job market is still very strong.
Go to Colby and then Howard.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. Given the economic data since the December meeting, is the trajectory for the Fed funds rate in the most recent SEP still the best guidepost for the policy path forward? Or does ongoing now mean more than 2 rate rises now?
So you're right. At the December meeting, we all wrote down our best estimates of what we thought the ultimate level would be, and that's obviously back in December, and the median for that was between 5 and 5.25%. At the March meeting, we're going to update those assessments. We did not update them today. We did, however, continue to say that we believe ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance of policy to bring inflation back down to 2%. We think we've covered a lot of ground, and financial conditions have certainly tightened. And I would say we still think there's work to do there. We haven't made a decision on exactly where that will be. I think we're going to be looking carefully at the incoming data between now and the March meeting and then the May meeting. I don't feel a lot of certainty about where that will be. It could certainly be higher than we're writing down right now. If we come to the view that we need to write down to move rates up beyond what we said in December, we would certainly do that. At the same time, if the data come in the other direction, then we'll make data-dependent decisions at coming meetings, of course.
Just as a quick follow-up, how are you viewing the kind of balance of risk between those 2 options of, the likelihood of maybe falling short of that or going beyond that level?
I guess I would say it this way. I continue to think that it's very difficult to manage the risk of doing too little and finding out in 6 or 12 months that we actually were close but didn't get the job done, and inflation springs back and we have to go back in, and now you really do worry about expectations getting unanchored and that kind of thing. This is a very difficult risk to manage. Whereas, of course, we have no incentive and no desire to over-tighten, but if we feel like we've gone too far, we can certainly, and inflation is coming down faster than we expect, then we have tools that would work on that. So I do think that in this situation where we have still the highest inflation in 40 years, the job is not fully done. As I started to mention earlier, we have a sector that represents 56% of the core inflation index where we don't see disinflation yet. So we don't see it. It's not happening yet. Inflation in core services ex housing is still running at 4% on a 6 and 12-month basis. So there's nothing happening there. In the other 2 sectors, representing less than 50%, you actually, I think, now have a story that is credible, that's coming together. Although you don't actually see disinflation yet in housing services, but it's in the pipeline, right? So for the third sector, we don't see anything here. So I think it would be premature, it would be very premature to declare victory or to think that we've really got this. We need to see, our goal, of course, is to bring inflation down. And how do we get that done? There are many, many factors driving inflation in that sector, and they should be coming into play to have inflation, the disinflationary process, begin in that sector. But so far, we don't see that. And I think until we do, we see ourselves as having a lot of work left to do.
Howard Schneider with Reuters, and thanks as usual. So I just wanted to connect a couple dots here. The statement made a number of changes that seem to be saying things are getting better. You're saying inflation has eased. That's new. You've taken out references to the war in Ukraine as causing price increases. You've taken out references to the pandemic. You've eliminated all the reasons that you said prices were being driven higher. Yet that's not mapping to any change in how you describe policy. We still have ongoing increases to come. So I'm wondering, why is that the case? And does it have more to do with uncertainty around the outlook, or more to do with you not wanting to give a very overeager market a reason to get ahead of itself and overreact?
So I guess I would say it this way. We can now say, I think, for the first time, that the disinflationary process has started. We can see that, and we see it really in goods prices so far. Goods prices is a big sector. This is what we thought would happen since the very beginning, and now here it is actually happening, and for the reasons we thought. It's supply chains, it's shortages, and it's demand revolving back towards services. So this is a good thing. This is a good thing. But that's around a quarter of the PCE price index, core PCE price index. So the second sector is housing services, and that's driven by very different things. And we, as I mentioned, with housing services, we expect, and other forecasters expect, that measured inflation will continue moving up for several months, but will then come down, assuming that new leases continue to be soft. And we do assume that. So we think that that's sort of in the pipeline. And we actually see disinflation in the goods sector, and we see it in the pipeline for two sectors that amount to a little less than half. So this is good, and we note that when we say inflation is coming down, this is good. We expect to see that disinflation process will be seen, we hope soon, in the core goods ex-housing, sorry, the core services ex-housing sector that I talked about. We don't see it yet. It's 7 or 8 different kinds of services. Not all of them are the same, and we have a sense of what's going on in each of those different subsections. Probably the biggest part of it, probably 60% of that is, research would show is sensitive to slack in the economy, and so the labor market will probably be important. Some of the other ones, the labor market's not going to be important. Many other factors will drive it. In any case, we don't see disinflation in that sector yet, and I think we need to see that. It's the majority of the core PCE index, which is the thing that we think is the best predictor of headline PCE, which is our mandate. So it's not that we're neither optimistic nor pessimistic. We're just telling you that we don't see inflation moving down yet in that large sector. I think we will fairly soon, but we don't see it yet. Until we do, I think we see ourselves, we got to be honest with ourselves, we see ourselves as having perhaps more persistent, we'll see more persistent inflation in that sector, which will take longer to get down. And we're just going to have to complete the job. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Nick Timmeros, The Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you observed several years ago that we learned we can have a low unemployment rate without above target inflation, and we have learned lately that inflation can come down from its uncomfortably high level despite a historically low unemployment rate. Given that, and given how much you did over the last year, why do you think further rate increases are needed? Why not stop here and see what transpires in the coming months before raising rates again?
So we've raised rates 4.5 percentage points, and we're talking about a couple of more rate hikes to get to that level we think is appropriately restrictive. And why do we think that's probably necessary? We think because inflation is still running very hot. We're, of course, taking into account long and variable lags, and we're thinking about that. The story we're telling about inflation is, to ourselves, and the way we understand it, is basically the three things that I've just gone through a couple times. And again, we don't see it affecting the services sector ex-housing yet. But I mean, I think our assessment is that we're not very far from that level. We don't know that, though. We don't know that. So I think we're living in a world of significant uncertainty. I would look across the spectrum of rates and see that real rates are now positive, right, by an appropriate set of measures, are positive across the yield curve. I think policy is restrictive. We're trying to make a fine judgment about how much is restrictive enough. That's all. And we're going to, that's why we're slowing down to 25 basis points. We're going to be carefully watching the economy and watching inflation and watching the progress of the disinflationary process.
Did you or your colleagues discuss the conditions for a pause at this meeting this week?
You'll see the minutes will come out in 3 weeks, and we'll give you a lot of detail. We spent a lot of time talking about the path ahead and the state of the economy, and I wouldn't want to start to describe all the details there, but that was the sense of the discussion, was really talking quite a bit about the path forward.
Victoria.
Hi, Chair Powell. I wanted to ask about the debt ceiling. Given that we've now hit up against it, I was wondering if the U.S. goes past the X date, will the Fed do whatever the Treasury directs as it relates to making payments as the fiscal agent, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So your question is, would we say your question again?
Will the Fed do what Treasury directs as it relates to making payments, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So you're really asking about, you're asking about prioritization, in effect, is what
yes,
you're, okay.
Yes.
So I feel like I have to say this. There's only one way forward here, and that is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling so that the United States government can pay all of its obligations when due. And any deviations from that path would be highly risky, and that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the consequences of failing to act in a timely manner. In terms of our relationship with the Treasury, we are their fiscal agent, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Are you actively doing any planning of what might happen in the event that that would happen?
I'm just going to leave it at that. This is a matter that's to be resolved between, it's really Congress's job to raise the debt ceiling, and I gather there are discussions happening, but they don't involve us. We're not involved in those discussions, so we're the fiscal agent.
Gina, and then Steve.
Gina Smilik from the New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. I wonder, was there any discussion today of the possibility of pausing rate increases and then restarting them? Lori Logan from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas seemed to suggest that that would be a possibility in a recent speech, and I wonder if that view is broadly shared on the committee.
So the committee, obviously, did not see this as a time to pause. We judged that the appropriate thing to do at this meeting was to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, and we said that we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate in order to attain that stance of sufficiently restrictive monetary policy that will bring inflation down to 2%. So that's the judgment that we made. We're gonna write down new forecasts in March, and we'll certainly be looking at the incoming data as everyone else will.
Sorry, I should have been clear. I mean, would it be possible to take a meeting off, for example, and then resume? Could you, rather than just doing at every meeting a move, go a little bit more slowly, take some gaps in between moves?
I mean, I think this is not something that the committee is thinking about or exploring in any kind of detail. In principle, though, we used to do was go every other meeting, if you remember, 25 basis points, and that was considered a fast pace. So I think a lot of options are available, and I mean, you saw what the Bank of Canada did, and they left it that they're willing to raise rates after pausing. But this is not something that the Federal Open Market Committee is on the point of deciding right now.
Steve.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chairman, the SEP has the PCE inflation rate in 2023 at 3.1%. Meanwhile, the 3-month annualized PCE is 2.1%, and you've achieved this without going to your 5.1% funds rate, which is what you have penciled in for this year. And you've also achieved it without the 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, which you have penciled in for this year. I'm wondering if you've considered the idea of whether or not your understanding of the inflation dynamic may be wrong, and it's possible to achieve these things without raising rates that high, and also without the surge in unemployment. And specifically, I wonder if you might comment on the speech given by Vice Chair Lael Brainerd, who said, to the extent that inputs other than wages may be responsible in part for important price increases for some non-housing services, an unwinding of these factors. In other words, it may not be wages, the idea that it may not require unemployment rising to get this sector of inflation under control. Thanks.
So a couple things. First, on the forecast, you're right. If you take very short-term, three-month, say, measures of PCE, core PCE inflation, they're quite low right now. But that's because that's driven by significantly negative readings from goods inflation. Most forecasters would think that the significantly negative readings will be transitory, and that goods inflation will move up fairly soon back up to its longer run trend of something around 0, something like that. So a lot of forecasts would call for core PCE to go back up to 4% by the middle of the year, for example. So that's really where the sustainable level is more like at 4%. So that would suggest there's work left to do. Let's say inflation does come down much faster than we expect, which is possible. As I mentioned, obviously our policy is data dependent. We would take that into account. In terms of the core non-housing services, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very diverse sector, 6 or 7 sectors, and So sectors that represent 55 or 60% of that subsectors of that sector we think are sensitive to slack in the economy, sensitive to the labor market in a way. But some of the other sectors are not. And for example, financial services is a big sector that's really not driven by labor markets, wages. So that's why I said there are a number of things that will affect. Take restaurants, right? So clearly labor is important for restaurants, but so are food prices. And transportation services is going to be driven by fuel prices, for example. So there are lots of things in that mix that will drive inflation. I would say overall, though, my own view would be that you're not going to have a sustainable return to 2% inflation in that sector without a better balance in the labor market. And I don't know what that will require in terms of increased unemployment, your question. I do think there are a number of dimensions through which the labor market can soften. And so far, we've got, as I mentioned, in goods, we have inflation moving down without the softening in the labor market. I think most forecasters would say that that unemployment will probably rise a bit from here, but I continue to think that there's a path to getting inflation back down to 2% without a really significant economic decline or a significant increase in unemployment. And that's because the setting we're in is quite different. The inflation that we originally got was very much a collision between very strong demand and hard supply constraints, not something that you really have seen in prior business cycles. And so now we see goods inflation coming down for the reasons we thought, and we understand why housing inflation will come down. And I think a story will emerge on the non-housing services sector soon enough. But I think there's ongoing disinflation, and we don't yet see weakening in the labor market. So we'll have to see.
Can we get there with 5%?
Certainly possible. Yeah, absolutely, it's possible. It's a question no one really knows. I think it's because this is not like the other business cycles in so many ways. It may well be that that it will take more slowing than we expect, than I expect, to get inflation down to 2%. But I don't. That's not my base case. My base case is that the economy can return to 2% inflation without a really significant downturn or a really big increase in unemployment. I think that's a possible outcome. I think many forecasters would say it's not the most likely outcome, but I would say there's a chance of it.
Michael.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'd like to pick up on what you were just saying about a substantial downturn and ask, with the full weight of your tightening not in place yet, and with the progress against inflation, there's still a lot of talk about very, very slow growth going forward in 2023. And the recession indicators are all suggesting that we are going to see recession this year. So I'm wondering if you've changed your view, or you have a more nuanced view of what you think the danger to economic growth is going forward, and whether you're very close to perhaps tipping it into the wrong place, which calls for more restraint on your part.
So I do think most forecasts and my own assessment would be that growth will continue, positive growth will continue, but at a subdued pace, as it did last year. We had growth of GDP growth of 1% last year, and also final sales growth, which we think is a better indicator of about 1%. I think most forecasts and certainly my assessment would be that growth will continue at a fairly subdued level this year. There are other factors, though, that need to be considered. You will have seen that the global picture is improving a bit, and that will matter for us potentially. The labor market remains very, very strong, and that's job creation, that's wages. As inflation does come down, sentiment will improve. You also, state and local governments are really flush these days with money, and many of them are considering tax cuts or even sending checks. So I think that's going to support. They're also spending a lot. There's a lot of spending coming in the construction pipeline. both private and public. And so that's going to support economic activity. So I think there's a good chance that those factors will help support positive growth this year. And that's my base case is that there will be positive growth this year.
Rich?
Thank you. Rich Miller from Bloomberg. First of all, how are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Fine.
Good, good. Second off, I think earlier on in the press conference, you said you need to see substantially more evidence of inflation coming down. Can you give us some idea of what you're thinking of? You mentioned 3 months, that we've seen 3 months in a row. Governor Waller suggested he might want to see 6 months. Is it just the inflation data, or do you have to see the labor market coming back into better balance to have that substantially more evidence
So
metric?
I don't think there's going to be a light switch flipped or anything like that. I think it's just an accumulation of evidence. So of course we'll be looking, by the time of the March meeting, we'll have 2 more employment reports, 2 more CPI reports, and we'll be looking at those carefully, as all of us will, and we'll be asking ourselves, what are they telling us? And soon after that, we'll have another ECI wage report, which, as you know, is
Berza obožava ovu priču
we like
S&P
because it adjusts for
4116.
composition and it's very complete. And the one we got, I guess it was yesterday, was constructive. It shows wages coming down, but still at a high level. They're still at a level that's well above where they were before the pandemic. So I don't want to put a number on it in terms of months, but as the accumulated evidence comes in, it's going to be reflected in our assessment of the outlook, and that will be reflected in our policy over time. But I will say, though, it is our job to restore price stability and achieve 2% inflation for the benefit of the American public. We're not, market participants have a very different job. And it's a fine job. It's a great job. In fact, I did that job for years, but in one form or another. But, we have to deliver that. And so we are strongly resolved that we will, complete this task because we think it has benefits that will, support economic activity and benefit the public for many, many years.
Edward?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Fed Chairman, for taking the questions. So you've talked about we had solid job growth. I'm Edward Lawrence from Fox Business, by the way. We had solid job growth, a slight falling in the increase in consumer spending. It seems so far it's been relatively mild from the economy to go from a 9.1% CPI inflation to 6.5% CPI inflation. Is the hard part yet to come, to go from 6.5 to 2?
I don't think we know, honestly. So we, of course, expected goods inflation to start coming down by the end of 2021. And it didn't. It didn't come down all through 22. And now it's coming down, and it's coming down pretty fast. So I would say this is not a standard business cycle where you can look at the last 10 times there was a global pandemic and we shut the economy down and Congress did what it did and we did what we did. It's unique. So I think certainty is just not appropriate here. Inflation, it's just harder to forecast inflation. It may come down faster. It may take longer to come down. And, our job is to deliver inflation back to target, and we will do that. But I think we're going to be cautious about declaring victory and, sending signals that we think that the game is won, because we've got a long way to go. It's the early stages of disinflation, and it's most welcome to be able to say that we are now in disinflation. But that's great, but we just see that it has to spread through the economy and that it's going to take some time. That's all.
How long do you see then the federal funds rate remaining at this elevated level?
So my forecast and that of my colleagues, as you will see from the SEP, and there are many different forecasts, but generally it's a forecast of slower growth, some softening in labor market conditions, and inflation moving down steadily, but not quickly. And in that case, if the economy performs broadly in line with those expectations, it will not be appropriate to cut rates this year, to loosen policy this year. Of course, other people have forecasts with inflation coming down much faster. That's a different thing. If that happens, if inflation comes down much faster, then we'll be seeing that, and it will be incorporated into our thinking about policy.
Simon?
Thank you, Chair Powell. Simon Rinovich with The Economist. May I ask a further question about the language around ongoing increases? That, of course, implies at least 2 further rate rises. If you look at Fed Fund futures pricing, the implication is that you'll raise rates one more time and then pause. Are you concerned about that divergence, or do you think if everything breaks right, is that a plausible outcome?
I'm not particularly concerned about the divergence, no, because it is largely due to the market's expectation that inflation will move down more quickly. I think that's the bigger part of that. So again, as I just mentioned, our forecasts, different participants have different forecasts, but generally those forecasts are for continued subdued growth, some softening in the labor market, but not a recession, And we have inflation moving down, into the somewhere in the mid-3s or maybe lower than that this year. We'll update that in March, but that's what we thought in December. Markets are past that. They show inflation coming down in some cases much quicker than that. So we'll just have to see. And we have a different view, it's a different forecast, really. Given our outlook, I don't see us cutting rates this year if our outlook turns true. As I mentioned just now, if we do see inflation coming down much more quickly, that'll play into our policy setting, of course.
Scott.
Hi, Chair Powell. Scott Horsey from NPR. One of the changes in the statement this month is that the committee is no longer listing public health as among the data points you'll consider in assessing conditions. What should we make of that? Does the Federal Reserve no longer see the pandemic as weighing on the economy?
That's the general sense of it. Look, I personally understand well that COVID is still out there, but that it's no longer playing an important role in our economy. And, we kept that statement in there for quite a while, and I think we knew we would take it out at some point. There's never a perfect time. But we thought that, people are handling it better, and the economy and the society are handling it better now. It doesn't really need to be in the Fed's monthly or post-meeting statement as an ongoing economic risk, as opposed to a health issue.
Nancy.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. I wanted to go back to another thing that Fed Vice Chair Lael Brainerd said recently. She said she doesn't see signs of a wage price spiral. And I'm wondering if you agree with that.
I do. Yeah, I do. You don't see that yet, but the whole point is, once you see it, you have a serious problem. That means that effectively in people's decision making, inflation has become a really salient issue, and once that happens, that's what we can't allow to happen. And so that's why we worry that the longer we're at this and the longer people are talking about inflation all day long, every day, the more risk of something like that. But no, there's not much. It's more of a risk. It always has been more of a risk than anything else. By the way, I think it's becoming less salient, and people are, we pick that up in conversations, and I've seen some data too that show people are, gradually, they're glad that inflation's coming down. People really don't like inflation, and as we see it coming down, that could also add a boost to economic activity. You look at the sentiment surveys now, and they're very, very low. With 3.5% unemployment and high wage increases nominally by historical standards, why can that be? It has to be inflation, right? So I think once inflation is seen to be coming down in coming months, even you will also see a boost to sentiment, I hope.
So that's what you're looking at most closely is consumer expectations.
That's at the very heart. It's consumers and businesses. Essentially, we believe that expectations of future inflation are a very important part of the process of creating inflation. That's a sort of a bedrock belief. In one way or another, it has to be. We think it's important. And in this case, I would say the risk 8 months ago or so, longer-term inflation expectations had moved up. We moved quite vigorously last year. Expectations seem to be well anchored, including at the shorter end now, not just the longer end. So it's, and I think that's very reassuring. I think, the markets have decided and the public has decided that inflation is going to come back down to 2%, and it's just a matter of us following through. That's immeasurably helpful to the process of getting inflation down. The fact that people now do generally believe that it will come down, that'll be part of the process of getting it down, and it's a very positive thing.
Greg.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Greg Robb from Market Watch. In the minutes of the December meeting, there was a couple sentences that struck people as important. When the committee said participants talked about this unwarranted easing of financial conditions was a risk, and it would make your life harder to bring inflation down. I haven't heard you talk much about that today or in the statement, so I was wondering, has that concern eased among members, or is that still something you're concerned about? Thank you.
I would put it this way, it's something that we monitor carefully. Financial conditions didn't really change much from the December meeting to now. They mostly went sideways or up and down, but came out in roughly the same place. It's important that the markets do reflect the tightening that we're putting in place. As we've discussed a couple times here, there's a difference in perspective by some market measures on how fast inflation will come down. We're just going to have to see. I'm not going to try to persuade people to have a different forecast. But our forecast is that it will take some time and some patience, and that we'll need to keep rates higher for longer. But we'll see.
Let's go to Brendan for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Brendan Peterson with Punchbowl News. I wanted to ask if the Fed takes into account at all the debt ceiling when it comes to quantitative tightening, given the fact that rapid or faster quantitative tightening could bring us closer, faster to that drop-dead debt ceiling deadline. Could it play an effect as we get closer to that drop-dead deadline this summer?
It's very hard to think about all the different possible ramifications, and I think the answer is basically I don't think there's likely to be any important interaction between the two, because I believe Congress will wind up acting, and as it will and must in the end, to raise the debt ceiling in a way that doesn't risk the progress we're making against inflation and the economy and the financial sector. I believe that will happen. I believe it will happen. We of course will monitor money market conditions carefully as the process moves on. For example, the Treasury General account will shrink down and then it will grow back up, and we understand there'll be lots of flows between there and the overnight repo facility and reserves. We understand all that. We're watching it carefully. We'll just be monitoring it. Thank you very much.
To bi bilo to što se tiče Jeroma. Do jaja priča. Standardica ništa nije odstupao od ranijih priča, sad ostaje taj CPI koji će drugačije da se računa, izbacit će se 1 godina iz računice, što pretpostavljam da čim se isključi godina koja je imala 9,2% inflaciju, odmah će automatski računica da ispadne manja. Sad, balance sheet federalnih rezervi, sam izvukao i čartovu, hoću već neko vreme da kažem na streamu, ali uvek nekako preskočim. Što se tiče generalno gledano BTC-a, ovo je prvi put da se Bitcoin nalazi u ovakvim finansijskim uslovima. Pretnja recesije i tako dalje, zatezanje. Da vidimo ovako. To. Sad ovako, ove crvene uspravne linije, to su halving eventovi, prepolovljavanje za majnere. Bele linije su prethodni vrhovi. To već znate verovatno svi. Do sada se nije dešavalo da Bitcoin u toku bear rana dotakne vrh prethodnog ciklusa. Znači nismo se spuštali toliko nisko ni ovde ni ovde. Sada smo to prvi put videli u ovom ciklusu i ne samo smo dodirnuli prethodni vrh, nego smo pali ispod njega na kratko. Vidjet ćemo koliko će to da dugo da ostane. Približavamo se 200 nedeljnom pokretnom proseku na 24.800, tako da ćemo vidjeti to ponašanje ugrubo. Ovo je jako bitno, ovaj chart i US 500 2008. Balans sheet federalnih rezervi je bio 900 milijardi. Nakon pucanja Lehman Brothersa i velike finansijske krize penjamo se na 2 triliona, 2,2, i od tog trenutka počinje polako da se primenjuje, dolazi do ubrzanja te politike. 2010. 11. smo isto imali neko uvećanje, ponovo od 2012. do 2014. na 4,5 triliona. Imali smo neko smanjenje od 18. do 19. i COVID kriza, januar 2020. Krećemo sa 4 triliona i završavamo ranije ove godine, to je ranije 2022. na 8,9 triliona. Sada su počeli da polako rasprodaju stvari iz tog balans sheeta, tu se nalaze, ne znam pojma nija šta sve, obveznice, akcije, neke proksi baskete koriste za kupovinu akcija sa berze, tako da jedna velika svinjarija gdje federalne rezerve jednostavno diktiraju kretanje tržišta i jednostavno BTC je postojao od 9. 10. ovdje negde ka gore. Tako da cjelokupan ovaj skok se desio u uslovima veoma laganih finansijskih uslova i ove korekcije koje smo imali, koje su bile 70-80% u prethodnim ciklusima, su bile u uslovima koji su bili generalno lagani. Sada ovo zatezanje kamatnih stopa, kamatne stope su sada na najvišem nivou od 2007. Tako kao bitcoin kao risk on asset, vidjet ćemo kako će on tu da se drži. Ovo malo zatezanje ovdje, to jest quantitative tightening, kako ga oni zovu, rasprodaja aseta iz balance sheeta, imala je za posljedicu godinu dana pada S&P-a, Nasdaka. Sad smo na 14% od totalnog vrha, u jednom trenutku smo pali na 27%, Nasdaq je malo jači pad zabeležio, u totalu bilo je 37%, sad smo se vratili na nekih 27% minusa od totalnog vrha. Industrija, Dow Jones Industrial Index stoji mnogo bolje, on je trenutno na 7% pada od totalnog vrha, u jednom trenutku je bilo 22%. Tako da i dalje se nalazimo u vremenu gdje federalne rezerve diktiraju kretanje cene manje više svega, eventualno diktiraju cenu nafte i zlata. Prilike manje više. Tako da, ono što je meni bitno, Jerome je rekao da ćemo efekte ovih zatezanja koje smo gledali celu 2022. koji su bili ekstremni i po njegovim rečima, te efekte tek treba da vidimo. Znači, što se tiče ovog pada na berzanskim indeksima, to je više psihološka reakcija učesnika na tržištu. Znači, svi su bili svesni šta to znači i svi su potrčali da prodaju, ne brže bolje, ali su generalno više prodavali nego što su kupovali, kombinovano sa smanjivanjem balans sheeta je dovelo do ovog pada koji je sada tu negde na 7, 10, 15%, zavisi koji fond gledamo. I ako sada uzmemo u obzir sva ta otpuštanja koja su počela se dešavaju po tim tech gigantima, smanjenje nekog prometa, mada to njihovo tržište i dalje dosta jako, veći je problem ta njihova državna blagajna i državni dug. Sam je rekao da što se tiče zaposlenosti, tu imaju blagi rizik od upadanja u tu spiralu tipa povećanje zarada, povećanje cena, što samo po sebi stvara spiralu, jel te, radnici mnogo više troše zbog povećanja cena i onda traže veće zarade i onda im to poslodavci omogućavaju, s obzirom na to da danas je bilo izašlo je istraživanje za otvaranje novih radnih mesta i to je prepucalo očekivanja, znači nezaposlenost, koliko reče, 3,7%, otvaranje novih radnih mesta, ja mislim da je 10-11 miliona, ako se ne varam, ako nisam pomešao, ću da vidim da li mogu da nađem. U svakom slučaju, znate sami šta to znači, kada imate nedostatak radnika morate da jednostavno ponudite veće plate, ne biste li nekako privukli te radnike, što upada u taj rizik od spirale povećanja plata u isto vreme sa povećanjem cena i to im je sada izgleda najveći problem. Nastavak. Tako, otvoreno je 11 miliona radnih mesta, očekivano je 10,2 miliona. Tako da to može da odigra neku vrstu pritiska. Ono što oni pokušavaju da izbegnu je ono što im se desilo tamo 70-ih, 80-ih. Imali su sličnu priču. Ako to dobro povezujem, to je verovatno povezano sa onom pričom kad su se nešto sa Arapima podžapali, pa su im ovi prekinuli dotok nafte, pa su imali tu neku frku paniku, gde su isto ovako zatezanjima pokušali da spuste inflaciju na prihvatljive nivoe, ali su se prerano obradovali i prekinuli ta zatezanja, što je dovelo do vraćanja, do još jednog talasa jake inflacije, pa su morali da nabiju kamatne stope u neki, koliko beše, 15-20%, i ta recesija im se odužila na 10 godina. Tako da Jerome ne želi da bude upamćen kao taj lik koji je dozvolio drugi talas inflacije i 10-godišnju recesiju, tako da zato i priča da sad, šta je rekao isto u martu, će da revidiraju svoje prognoze što se tiče maksimuma kamatnih stopa, za koje su rekli da treba da budu negde oko 5,5%. Znači, da podsjetim, 4,75 su trenutno kamatne stope, 5,5 bi značilo još 3 komada, još 3 zatezanja pod 0,25. Rekao je, šta je još rekao zanimljivo, da može da se uzme u obzir da neće biti popuštanja verovatno do 24. što uvek može da se koriguje, to je isto naglasio kod svakog odgovora, naglasio je da svi podaci mogu da se okrenu, tipa za mesec dana mogu da nam dođu drugačiji podaci, tako da će vrlo lako da koriguju svoje stavove i prognoze. U svakom slučaju najveći mu je strah da ne odustane od posla prerano i da ne dozvoli taj drugi talas inflacije. Ako dođe do prevelikog zatezanja, mogu uvek vrlo lako da počnu da otpuštaju vrlo brzo, za to imaju alat protiv čega mogu da se bore, a za drugi talas inflacije nemaju baš tako efektivne alate. Tako da, to je inače neki temelj mog razmišljanja da sve ovo što sada vidimo, ovi impulsni skokovi i talasi na gore, mogu vrlo lako da se završe krešom, jer neku nesigurnost, ja lično imam, ja razmišljam samo naglas, svakom ostaje da sam izvodi zaključke. Nekako mi je to, previše su mi pesimistični po tom pitanju. Jerome kaže da prosto jednostavno ovaj pad nije izazvan efektom zatezanja kamata. Ovaj pad je izazvan psihološkim efektom kod ljudi, kod investitora, a prave efekte na samom tržištu ćemo da vidimo uskoro. Znači, cijela prošla godina je bila samo psihološki dump, a sada treba dođe onaj pravi fundamentalni, ako mu je zaverovati. Sad, To može da možda bitno, ne mora da znači. Ćemo da vidimo šta se dešava sa samim firmama. Meta udara u 200-dnevni pokretni prosek drugi put posle 3-4 dana. Sad sa ovakvim blagim nastupom Jeroma, pretpostavljam da ćemo verovatno imati neki talas na gore, pošto su već sve kompanije koje su bile u fokusu izbacile svoje zarade, najave o otpuštanjima, tako dalje. Apple jako ide ka gore, ovo je odličan impuls. 16% dobitak od kad je ovo 3. januar, tako da ok priča skroz. Amazon takođe lagano ide. U svakom slučaju sve te akcije se kreću polako ka 200-dnevnom pokretnom proseku. One koje su stigle do njega imali smo neko odbijanje pre par dana. Oni koji nisu stižu sada, bukvalno ili danas ili verovatno će stići ove nedelje. PayPal, neko mini odbijanje, mada ništa specijalno, može da bude prebačeno vrlo lako do kraja trgovinskog dana. Tesla izbija iz ove šumice, što je ok posle ovolikog dampa. Ok imati ovakve refleksivne pumpe. Coinbase 10% danas, skoro 9%. Tako da ćemo vidjeti pravu snagu kad dođemo do tih 200-dnevnih pokretnih proseka. Snap je dumpovo u post marketu nakon onih loših izveštaja, 15% u jednom trenutku. Danas imamo blagi retracement. Netflix nastavlja svoj put, sad Netflix dobro stoji, Netflix stoji bolje od svih ostalih. Već sam pričao, imali su skoro duplo više subscribera od očekivanog, tako da top priča, verovatno zbog poskupljenja, zbog ovoga onoga, ljudi će radije da ostanu kući gledaju Netflix nego da idu napolje po restoranima, bioskopima. Bed Bath & Beyond, to sam juče rekao, verovatno podnosi prijavu za bankrot. Srebro, zlato, prvo da pogledam, zlato 1% na dan za zlato, vrhunski. Ima tu nekih par nivoa, ali kažem, tehnički gledano, zlato ubija koliko je jako stoji. Znači, treba gledati ovaj rising wedge, inače bearish strukturu, 60% puta dolazi do slamanja cene na dole. Ovde smo u stvari imali upsloping konsolidaciju, crveni momentum, a u isto vreme penjanje cene ka gore, izbijanje iz ove strukture u kontrasmeru. Opet smo imali crveni momentum, neki minijaturni prethodnih par dana. Izgleda da to sve u vidu samo neke konsolidacije, tako da ako se nastavi ovakva priča, zlato ubrzo posećuje all time high 2000, koliko beše 75, 2075, vrh iz GU, šta je GU, broz? GBP USD. Brate, kako stoji Britanija i kakve su one izveštaje i prognoze, kontraintuitivno izgleda. Ne znam šta, mora da pogledam šta se dešava sa njihovim kamatnim stopama, kako će oni to treba da pogledaš. Znači, ako Britanci budu zatezali kamatne stope jače od Amerikanaca, možeš da očekuješ rast funte u odnosu na dolar. Ali Britanci su do jaja problemu, jer oni imaju ogromne dugove, imaju sad inflacija, ih trese mnogo jako, tako da pretpostavljam da pitaš zbog toga što imaš neke funte ili primaš lovu, platu neku. Ne bi da ti delim savete nikakve, ali kažem, to ti je osnova, treba da pogledaš, to ću ja videti kad završim stream, pa ću sutrašnjem da obradim koliko oni nameravaju da zatežu i šta nameravaju da rade. Ako budu zatezali jače od Amerikanaca, funta najverovatnije će ići jače od dolara, ali ako bude bilo nekog popuštanja s njihove strane, može se desi potapanje. Sad ovako, ovdje imaš seriju nižih vrhova i nižih dna. Tako da ako se ne polomi ovaj trend, ako se ne slomi ovaj trend, ne stoji to dobro. Pravo ti kažem, zeleni momentum jako visoko, ovo ti sad gledam na nedeljnom, zeleni momentum je jako visok, ali cena nije prebacila prethodni vrh, 200 nedeljni pokretni prosek je iznad, 200-dnevni je prebačen, sad je ovo crveni momentum, prvi dan, treba to ispratiti, kažem ti, mnogo je značajno šta će njihova centralna banka da radi po tom pitanju. Gde smo sada? Na 3.5. Borrowing, solvents, 15. Dobro. Dobro. Kažem ti, treba to da vidiš i na osnovu toga doneseš neke zaključke. Što se tiče samog dolara, evo ovako je to izgledalo danas. Tako da, kažem ti, ako nastave Britanci da zatežu malo jače, može da očekuješ verovatno neki rast u odnosu na dolar, pošto su, mislim da smo poljubili neko ono skoro pa istorijsko dno. To ti je nešto kratkoročno tipa. Što se tiče dugoročne priče, generalno cijela Evropa ne stoji dobro u odnosu na Ameriku. Inflacija kida 15% u nekim zemljama. Industrija je u problemu zbog skupih energenata, tako da dugoročno gledano to je problem do jaja. Ali dok još uvijek traje ova borba centralnih banaka među sobom, ko će šta kako zateže, to moraš da pratiš da bi dalje znao. Što se tiče tehničke analize, to sam pričao, valute, forex, trading, meni nema nikakvog smisla, jer jednostavno, znaš, ne možeš da pretpostaviš šta će neki guverner Narodne banke da izađe da kaže, a možda izađe da kaže bukvalno bilo šta. Mogu da izmisle preko noći neku novu foru šta će da rade i da ti, brate, trade krene kontra tebe odmah, bukvalno instant. Što se tiče tehničke analize, istorijsko dno. Što se tiče funta dolara, neki otpor, jedan, dva, gde si tu? Jedan, četiri sljedeći značajni nivo. Ako imamo 1, 2, 3, 4 nedelje baš velike kupovine. Tako da to ti je manje više to. Ako krenemo ka gore, zadržavanje na 1.4 verovatno. Ako se održi ovaj nivo 1.2 to je dobro. Ako krenemo ispod i ako se padne ispod ovog nivoa 1.05, ono bukvalno padaš kao cigla kroz vodu i to je to. Nema na čemu buraz. Dinar jača u odnosu na dolar, ajde kad sam već kod Forexa da pregledam i te gluposti. Odlično Jorgo, Jorgovanka sagoreva milijarde, ne pita za sutra, samo da se održimo na 117, to je top. Da vidimo, to je gotovo. Total kripto market cap, prebacili smo trilion i verovatno idemo ka ovoj zoni bez nekog zadržavanja preteranog 1,1 do 1,15 triliona. Dobra priča. Ethereum ka BTC-u, da smo se zaustavili na dobrom nivou. Nismo pogodili ovaj demand line, mada nema veze, to bi pokazalo neku snagu. Bitcoin dominance nastavlja da raste. 44, imali smo blagu konsolidaciju, upsloping, crveni momentum, a skačemo, to je dobra priča. Što se tiče samog BTC-a, 23.577, mi smo ispratili toliko jako ovu pumpu koliko sam očekivao. S&P je pokidao 4140, ulazimo u neki power hour američke trgovine. Tako da ono, sljedeći neki nivo 4243. Verovatno probijamo ove vrhove prethodne, jer snaga je top pumpa na dan 1.82, Bitcoin 2%, čudno s obzirom na to da S&P kad napumpa 1-2%, Bitcoin ume da iscepa 5-6. Tako da ono, vidjet ćemo kad se Azija upali večeras posle 1. Ethereum, odlična priča, crveni momentum se gasi, našli smo neku podršku na 1500. To je odlično. Odlična priča. Ako izbijemo iz ove šumice tipa 1683, sljedeća meta 2046. BNB, također upsloping, konsolidacija, izbijanje iz ove strukture na gore, jako visoka meta, ja mislim da je 430 i jače 500, što koincidira sa 1618, ali za to bi potrebni bili meseci da se dogodi. Tako da vidjet ćemo. Cardano konačno izgleda pomalja glavu iznad ove zone prethodnog vrha 2018. 200-dnevni pokretni prosek koji je više od 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dan. 5. dan radimo 200-dnevni pokretni prosek, šta je ovo 786 u isto vreme, tako da ovo je ekstremna snaga tipa. Radimo 3 izuzetno značajna otpora odjednom i čini se da ćemo da razbijemo te prepreke. Iznad toga 56 centi, 66 neki otpori. Ako se Cardano odlepi od tog patosa 100% dobitak, verovatno bi mu trebalo nekih mjesec dana da se to odigra. Matic danas pumpa 4,5%. Top priča za ovoliki coin, mada generalno neko malo podbacivanje, nije to ništa specijalno u odnosu na ostale dobitnike. AVAX također visi na 886, napravili smo podršku. Ako se izbije iz ovog range preko $20, opušteno $30, tipa vrlo brzo, 40% dobitak. Aptos je imao neku korekciju, tip koliko beše 20%, 23%. Snaga kupaca je neverovatna jer nismo se vratili ni da testiramo 1.618. Ako se ova pumpa nastavi, lagano posle probijanja nivoa $20, možda ne mora čak da dođe ni do zadržavanja na 2.618, možda je sljedeća stanica 25.30. Phantom, da li je Phantom sada? Phantom je najjači, definitivno. Phantom je pobio sve u ovom ranu. 2.618 dodirnuto malo pre, bukvalno 240% dobitak, ali tehnički gledano prvi koji je dostigao tih 2.618 fib range-a, tako da i u bull runu je imao 150.000 dobitak. Ne znam koji je, da kažemo, ozbiljniji token imao takav skok. Oni jači su bili negde u range-u 15, 20, 30.000. Tako da Phantom meni najverovatnije ostaje jedan od favorita za sljedeći bull run. Ocean također isto ozbiljna snaga se pokazuje ovdje. Kupci jednostavno ne dozvoljavaju da se testira prethodni nivo otpora kao trenutna podrška, što je jednostavno nuklearni nivo kupovine. Hedera Hashgraph, top testiranje prethodnog vrha iz 5. novembra u vidu podrške ovaj put. Taj nivo se testira od 23. januara do danas i čini se da je potvrđen kao podrška, tako da za H-bar kretanje sljedeća stanica tipa 7% iznad nas, 20% prethodni vrhovi i zona iz 2020. februar. Nakon toga neki značajniji nivoji, imamo 63 do 80% do 126% potencijalnih dobitaka ako se izađe iz ove inicijalne šume dole. Axie Infinity, bukvalno džuska između mid-range do top tier shitcoina. 200-dnevni pokretni prosek smo izgubili pre neki dan, ali sada ga ponovo izgleda radimo. Sve to se dešava iznad vrha od 5. novembra, tako da je to ok. Tehnički osrednje stoji, nije loše. Audius, pali smo ispod tog vrha 5. novembra, ali smo jako blizu. Ili nismo pali? Pali smo za 2 dana, ali sada pravimo podršku na njemu. 886 isto testiran kao podrška, 200-dnevni pokretni prosek daleko ispod nas. Kao što sam rekao, Audius, pumpa izazvana listovanjem na Coinbase-u, što je generalno uvek signal za pumpu za shitcoine. Najveća menjačnica u najbogatijoj naciji gde ljudi imaju najviše para za zajebanciju, tako da ništa spec. Gala opet slično kao i kod ovih gore, nepostojeća snaga prodavaca da se testira barem vrh iz 5. novembra, dobro ovo je 31. oktobar, postavio vrh, ali to je to. Tako da najverovatnije dalje kretanje na gore. ICP jedan od boljih, tehnički gledano, nalazimo se između dve zone. Vrhunski postavio je prethodni vrh kao podršku je potvrdio. 50% potencijalni dobitak do 60. Imamo 1.618, verovatno značajnija zona na $7. Ovaj koincidira tu s ovim dnom. Tako da to je to. ICP top stoji, koti takođe slabost prodavaca, nemogućnost da se dotakne 200-dnevni pokretni prosek. 0.618 nivo takođe nije dodirnut. Koliko smo imali dampu, koliko je ovo, 10 dana recimo. Korekcija 27%. Vidjet ćemo dalje ponašanje. Bitcoin i dalje stoji tu negdje 23.560, što je ok. DGB, sve u svemu top ovo izgleda i u vidu onih izveštaja, non stop ponavljam, drugačije se računa inflacija sada, treba sačekati taj CPI izveštaj. Koliko sve bude cool, retail će verovatno da gura dokle god bude imao love. Tako da svi ovi tokeni koje sam listovao među prve, tu ih sad već ima dosta, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 14, 15, 16, da kažemo 17, 18 shitcoina koji su pokidali ovo tržište. Najverovatnije imaju veliki potencijal što se tehničkih stvari tiče da pokidaju sljedeći bull run. Tu bih samo isključio Solanu i Galu, zato što su oni napumpani. Solana od strane Vitalika, Gala od strane one objave da će Dwayne Rock Johnson da bude uključen u nekakvu saradnju, tako da tu bi bio oprezan jedino. Ovi ostali, Harmony postavio podršku 2 dana za redom na 886, daleko iznad 200-dnevnog pokretnog proseka. Nastavljamo put na gore. Harmony 150% dobitak. Coin sa jako dobrim izgledima za budućnost. Tu mu je rame uz rame Zilika što se tiče nekih, da kažem, fundamentalnih, iako pričam da ne postoji fundamentalna analiza za kripto. Zilika je uvezana, imaju neki X-CAD, X-Academy kao za neke influencere gluposti, ali to je ono što se računa u bull runu, koliko influencera će da gura vaš shitcoin, a Zilika ima mrežu koju pravi specijalno za te majmune, tako da potencijalno top priča 135% dobitak od dna danas. Čini se postavljanje 200-dnevnog pokretnog proseka kao podrške, probijanje 786 fib nivoa, tako da za Ziliku da vidim, moguće da je ovo dno totalno. Zilika isto podrum nivoji kao i mnogi. Da vidim potencijalni dobitak odavde, prvo zaustavljanje na 80% ukoliko se izađe iz ove šumice otpora, potencijalno 200%, ali ono, kažem, nategnuta priča. Nemojte shvatiti ništa kao nekakve savete, predviđanja, samo razmišljam na glas. Ovo je Filecoin, zašto ja pričam za Ziliku? Filecoin potencijalnih 200, a Zilika je zilika ispod 200-dnevnog pokretnog prosjeka. Znači sve ovo malo pre što sam rekao važi za Filecoin. Potencijalni dobitak 200% i ispod svih nivoa cena. Zilika ne stoji tako sjajno tehnički kao ostali zato što je ispod 200-dnevnog pokretnog. Dobra stvar je što je 0.618 podrška već od 21. januara, tako da je to ono, da kažem, dobar signal. Solana, odbijanje, smo imali neko na 200-dnevni pokretni prosjek, u isto vreme pravimo podršku na 0.5 fib nivo. To ok, band, šta sam rekao, band iznad $2, verovatno samo pitanje trenutka kada udaramo u 3, to je 40% skok, potencijalno 3.3, 56% skok ako se izbije iz te zone, odavde mereno 150% potencijalni dobitak, to isto kao i za sve shitcoine, ako se ovaj rana nastavi barem još mesec, 2 dana, ako ne dođe do nekog ozbiljnijeg ekonomskog finansijskog slamanja. QNT ok stoji što se tiče 200-dnevnog pokretnog, ali smo plitko u fib retracementu i tu smo na nekom ovom nivou koliko ovo $150. Pogledamo ovo na nedeljnom ovo neko nepravilni inverse head and shoulders, ali ovaj vrh taj argument poništava. Ovo je ok struktura za dalje kretanje na gore. Ako gledamo to na nedeljnom, potencijalno 270 prvi nivo zadržavanja. Ali kažem, za nedeljni to je igranka koja traje mesecima. Ništa što se tiče tih bitnih, to je to. SNX, što se tiče ovih harmonika, 10% SNX danas, probijen 200-dnevni pokretni, 786 u isto vreme, 0.618 nam sada glumi podršku, tako da skroz ok priča za SNX. Veliki potencijal tehnički gledano, da li je on u podrumu, jeste, nema, da odradimo ove nivoje prethodnog dna iz 2020. i potencijal za skok. Prvi neki lokalni vrhovi i otpori 30 do 60% dobitak, ako se izbije iz tih nivoa 130%, tipa za mesec i po dana. Wi-Fi, ako odradi ovu liniju 7452, nenormalni dobici nas očekuju, tipa neki nivoji 11 do 18.000, jako niska zaliha ovog tokena, bukvalno ono garantuje pumpe 60% do 150% potencijalne pumpe. 36.000 coina Wi-Fi ima u opticaju, tako da je pumpanje ovog coina laka priča. XRP mrtvilo, Ethereum Classic takođe, Shiba već ok stoji, 0.5 fib retracement iznad 200-dnevnog pokretnog proseka, isto potencijal za pumpu dosta velik. Šta ti bi? Shiba, koliko god smešno da zvuči, ima jak potencijal za pumpu tipa 150 do 200% mesec i po dana, ako se održi ova pumpa sa sadašnjom snagom. To je to otprilike za večeras. Hvala svima što ste bili sa mnom. Laku noć, pa se gledamo sutra.